Welcome to my second podcast on the person mythology. And the title of this podcast is The American Self and the Other, or How Many Americans Does It Take for One American to Individuate? So, of course, um, the idea is that how many Americans does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the joke is, oh, it should take only one American to individuate, but it always takes more than one, a whole society, in fact, in order to back up the individuation process. So first we're going to look at is what is individuation. So individuation, according to Jung, was the process of looking inward and confronting the shadow and the unconscious forces that are underlying one's own psyche. Um, and we have Marie Lewin Franz wrote an essay on the process of individuation in Carl Jung's edited book, Man is Symbols, where she talked about there's only one thing seems to work is to turn directly into the approaching darkness without prejudice and totally naively and try to find out what its secret aim is and what it wants from you. So every person has to look inward. And in order to look inward, we can't just see the other, we can't project um our psychic development onto others. The shadow that we see within ourselves is sometimes projected onto the other outside of us. Um, so a nation has been subject to continual revision, and when we have psychic inflation of underlying processes of the mind are then projected onto outer circumstances, we have a kind of psychic inflation that Jung talks about in Jung and his politics. That was from this one. Odin Judge, Jung and Politics, Political and Social Ideas of Carl Jung. Right here, this highlighted one. Um, so we have here is a nation in which is going kind of psychic inflation, where this ongoing unconscious powers of the individual are being projected onto groups of people, and how modern Americans develop the capacity to form identities separate from this tribe or nation. We must seek the story of our own lives in the spiritual guidance that have only been found in myth and fairy tales. So now looking back at Jungian politics, that book I just mentioned, individual responsibility has been collectivized, and we have a group psychology that's going on that relinquished by the individual and delegate to a corporate body. This gradual erosion of man's capacity for self-reliance and individual responsibility begins in education and continues in university and pervades all areas of social life. Because in education, they're learning the common language of the society. And how does one continue to look inward for one's own signals and at the same time be kind of indoctrinated in this collective language? How do we become both look inward and see, and at the same time not be confused about what is going on inside of us and what is going on outside of us? So, in Mind, Self, and Society by George H. Mead, education is definitely the process of taking a certain organized set of responses to one's stimulation. Um, until one can respond as the community responds to himself. So he's learning, he's getting acclimatized to society. Just as when we know a red light is to stop, he explains traffic signals being an example. We know a red light means to stop, we know a green light means to go, or the motions of a traffic agent become internalized. The language of the society becomes internalized, and it becomes the meshing of the collective unconscious inside of ourselves, and these different impulses or needs become manifest within ourselves. Latent tendencies become manifest inside of ourselves that otherwise may not have been there. But we're all connected in this ocean of society. So the organized other presents ourselves in the community of um, the organized other presents themselves within the community of narrow diameter. We're rolling ourselves a member of a larger community. That's what education partially has to do with. But now in the virtues of selfishness by Ayn Rand, we talk about we have to be so integrated, cannot be so integrated that an idea is not derived from reality. And what is reality? We have a self, others, or society, and reality, which connects us. Um, and we have to be able to use reason and judgment to be able to apply to the concepts and understanding of this reality. An individual is a man who is for his own sake, lives for his own sake, neither sacrifice themselves, nor does he deals in commerce. So this has to do with capitalism. We're like basically communicating through commerce with each other. So tying back to how this hyper capitalism has been created, which has made the individual a product rather than a consumer or like a trader. So the problem is instead of trading, he's being traded. So that's what's wrong with American society, essentially, which is talked about in Hooked, How to Build Mental Habit Forming Products, how the weaponization of um capitalism for using the individual as a product in order to sustain itself is expressed in that book, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. I mean, although he takes a little bit of an objective viewpoint of that in this book. He's like, oh, this is just how to build habit-forming products, and we all have the capacity to reject that idea, but at the same time, the manipulation is real. So what we have here now is the closed partisan mind. So we move from kind of selfishness to the idea of being in a bubble, and how selective vision and focus, and that we want to now align ourselves with like-minded people. And some part of humanity nature may indeed be anti-liberal democracy. They want someone to rule over them, actually, essentially, which has to do with Hobbes and the Leviathan. Has It's natural for human beings to want to be ruled or told what to do, but we want to know that institutions can be designed to protect us from our worst impulse. That shadow I was talking about, that shadow element that is projected onto society, that interior individuation process has to do with confronting the shadow. So alienation has part to do with the capitalism. We have a lot of alienation in the Marxist perspective. In order to create a sane society, according to Fromm, a sane society is someone that has gone past that alienation. The alienation means a mode of experience in which a person experiences as an alien or as outside of, he's become estranged from himself. And he does not experience himself as the center of the world, the creator of his own actions, but his acts and their consequences have become his masters, who must be obeyed or even worship. Um, so in this alienation, in the shadow, he has to own his own shadow and not project it in order to advance in society. Um, Finally, Americans have become increasingly separate from each other, isolated people who are easier to control. So what we have here is this is from Levine, um, Get Up, Stand Up, Uniting Populists, Energizing the Defeated, and Battling the Corporate Elite in 2011. So any interruption in the individuation process will upset the balance of the whole community. If you're trapped in survival mode, we can never advance the past this state in self-actualization. So that's what happens when hypercapitalism interrupts that process and makes us a product rather than a producer or trader, according to the ideas of Ayn Rand in her book Atlas Shrugged, where she talks about like having commerce, but that commerce and the cowboy mentality is ultimately usurped by or appended by the idea of us being the product. So this creates a kind of wasteland, and that wasteland, which is talked about in The Mask of God's Created Mythology by Joseph Campbell in 1976, even. Um, Myth is patterned by authority, not emergent to life. Um, is that utopia comes from the idea that 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 we're free from authority, but that this is kind of an ironic statement where myth is powered by authority, not emerged from life, where there is no poetry to see, no adventure to be lived. We're all set for all and forever utopia. It's kind of an ironic statement here. Um, the wasteland, let's say, is any world in which uh, force, not love, indoctrination, not education, authority, not experience, prevail in the ordering of lives, where myths and rights enforces and received are consequently unrelated to the actual inward realizations, needs, and potentialities of those upon which they are impressed. So therefore, this is again showing in order to get there, we have to be able to do education, not indoctrination, experience, not authority. Where the ordering of lives comes from the myth originates from actual inward realizations and potentialities. Freedom, alchemy of a voluntary society kind of proposes this kind of actual ideal society, which the answer will be given by history, where men and women of flesh and blood transform their individual psyches. So when men and women of blood transform their individual psyches, we begin to see less projection, less shadow throwing, less accusation, less bubble in the bubble kind of talk, because you so met your other, you've met your inward self, you met your shadow, so that then society then is able to see that the close parts of mind is not close parts of Ludwig MD by Cornell Press in 2023 examined the close parts in mind, that is not the best way to do it, that this is actually an unknown shadow that is created, and that we have to unity with nature is so important, that's when we come to unity with our own nature, our inward nature is so important. When we are able to reconcile that. And finally, in this piece, socio-political other, or Jungian phenomenological analysis of individuation through conflict, um, Carly Solomon talks about in her video um, how the confrontation with the socio-political other can be a very distressing and painful process in which we're confronting the inner shadow as well as the outer shadow, because this one is mixed with the other. So when we see the fear for those we love, fear for those we concerned about their freedom and happiness, we see that fear coming up. We begin to internalize with that which is um, shown, the pain of others becomes internalized, and then we get lost in these various psychodramas. So we must truly act in terms of our self-interest. If we truly act in terms of our self-interest, in the virtue of selfishness, then truly we'd be owning. And the ideal of Ayn Rand, I think, is truly admirable, the ideals, but it never happens like that in practice. Just as she criticizes the fact that socialism and Marxism don't act that way in reality, so too does her philosophy not actualize itself in reality to the extent to which she believes it will. Um, how many people are actually truly living up to their full idea of their self, meeting others as traders, not as looters, as producers, not as Attilas. How many people are able to do that is the question. This ideal is not always met. And a lot of times they're projected the shadow against the other person and looting them and killing them and subjecting them. The only way that America was formed is through the genocide and the subjugation of the African population, and slavery and the genocide of Native indigenous peoples. So that concludes that when we individuate, we have to do so by looking inward, and it takes one American to individuate, and the power of being able to stop projecting, the power of being able to stand up for one's own individuation process is tremendous. And sometimes, but if we're able to slowly, one by one, through human contact, communicate that ideal, we might be getting somewhere. Thank you.